Let me, as the other panelists and moderators have done, also just briefly introduce the theme and then also the panel before we start with brief presentations, maximum 10 minutes for each. Then we will have a brief discussion here among panelists, assuming that the internet connection works. You're always invited to either pose questions to all the panelists in person or via the internet. So please feel free to submit those questions if you want to join the discussion. As the title goes, Transatlantic Security and Foreign Policy Under Stress. And the stress element in the title of this final panel reiterates a theme that has been popping up during all our sessions here since last night with the keynote opening by Ambassador Chariot, which is the crisis theme. The crisis theme in many ways is the standard story that you can all hear these days when we talk about transatlantic relations. And it is a theme that is in many ways, I would at least argue, related more or less subconsciously to another quite dominant narrative in how we think about transatlantic relations, which is the transatlantic relationship against the background of the post-World War II world, which was obviously very much shaped as a whole by this relationship and what we used to call the East-West conflict or the Cold War. In many ways, this relationship and conflict line that was shaping global politics, there was no China really mattering in those old days. This conflict with two so-called superpowers, as we used to call them in the past, was at the center of global politics, and Germany, divided Germany, was at the center of this global conflict. I think many of us do not sufficiently appreciate the fact that the story of crisis that we tell each other today about this relationship unfolds against this particular background. A background that was obviously shaped by security institutions such as NATO and the Warsaw Pact. And I think one has to recall in that context what one of the first Secretary Generals of NATO quipped at an early stage of the history of the alliance, what the purpose of it was. NATO was there to keep the Americans in, the Russians out, and the Germans down. This is the old story about purposes of NATO, the central task of the transatlantic relationship. And just recalling that kind of dominant narrative from the old days also reminds us how central security and insecurity for both sides of the Atlantic were for shaping our relationship. The title of this conference is Geteilte Zukunft, Europa, Amerika. And as you have possibly seen, the English translation emphasizes that there's not a single word that captures the geteilte Welt or geteilte Zukunft aspect in German, because the English title says shared or divergent, geteilt. And in many ways, this old way of conceiving of transatlantic relations as one of common destiny, especially as far as our senses of security and insecurity is concerned, is no longer at the center of how we look at the relationship today. Those of you or us who had been studying security in the old days and still do so today, and many of our panelists are, might remind that the so-called central theater of military preparations was the center of Germany, East and West. And if you recall that kind of narrative from the old days and contrast it with the situation today, a description of the crisis that we face and Ambassador Chariot last night said it's the most severe crisis of transatlantic relations in the past 70 years, is of course also one that could be told in terms of fundamental shifts in how we might analyze global politics with regard to transatlantic relations from a bird's eye perspective. Globally, Europe today is in many ways marginalized. At least that is, if you look at global politics from a Beijing or Washington, DC perspective. Europe is no longer as much at the center of the concerns of these new players, big players in global politics, as in the old days when the North from Washington, Vancouver, via Vladivostok, Moscow, and London, the North was the defining line of global politics. Today, the center has obviously shifted in many ways, at least that is for decision makers in Beijing and in Washington, to this looming bilateral relationship between China and the US. And Ambassador Chariot last night rightly emphasized that whatever disagreements there might be in the US these days, Democrats and Republicans look at this, you might say, new bipolarity as a unifying factor. Now, this means that Europe, and therefore also transatlantic relations, looks very differently today from a European / Berlin, Paris, London, or what have you perspective, as well as it does from a Washington perspective. And this also means that if you recall Lord Ismay and the purpose of NATO, that the fact that Germany as a power in European politics today is obviously a leading power also puts into a very different perspective how purposes of transatlantic relations as far as Germany is concerned and Germany's contribution or expected contribution to the relationship have also fundamentally changed. All these issues will be topics on this panel at the end of our conference, and I'm very glad that I can present to you 4 panelists who are excellent experts in this particular field. In Washington, let me start with Constanze Stelzenmüller, who is, I would think, one of the top 5 experts in the field of European transatlantic foreign and security policy, who has been studying this relationship for decades now from both sides of the Atlantic. Constanze is a senior fellow at this point in time at the Center of the United States and Europe at Brookings. She had been a Kissinger Chair on Foreign Policy and International Relations at the Library of Congress from October 19 to this March, so essentially the beginning of the Corona crisis in earnest. She is, or has been from 14 to 19, the first Robert Bosch Senior Fellow at Brookings, and before that worked on European transatlantic security issues as head of the German Marshall Fund office in Berlin as a senior transatlantic fellow. Among others, she has also headed the very influential Transatlantic Trends Survey program, a survey that has been quite important to actually get clear-cut assessments as to how the moods on both sides of the Atlantic have developed. Before that, she was an editor of the political section of Die Zeit, of course, one of the foremost German weeklies. Constanze Stelzenmüller has published in many outlets, and you might rank all the major newspapers, journals in both North America and Europe as major outlets. So she's a well-established name in the field, and I'm glad, Constanze, that you were able to join us today, even though you are a bit removed in Washington, D.C. Thank you. The second colleague from the US sitting in Washington, D.C. is Professor Michael Kimmage. Michael is a professor of history at Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C., working on the role of the West in the Cold War, relations between the US and Russia, and the relationship between Europe and the US. He has focused in his academic work on diplomacy and history of culture and ideas as a catalyst in international affairs, and I'm pretty sure that we'll come back to that today because one of his most recent publications is a book on what he called the abandonment of the West, the history of an idea on American foreign policy, which was published in April of this year. Michael also has practical experience. He was the head of the Russia-Ukraine department in the planning staff of the Department of State between 2014 and 2016, and is also an analyst and commentator in major newspapers. On the German side here, that is an American citizen and a German citizen. We have on our left Professor Dr. Lora Viola. She is a professor of North American Foreign and Security Policy at the John F. Kennedy Institute of the Freie Universität Berlin. She does research, particularly in the fields of change and transformation of international organizations, institutional legitimacy, things we discussed before in the previous panel, institutionalized inequality, as well as US foreign policy and diplomacy. Professor Viola has published in all the major academic journals that we in international affairs consider to be serious and primer. She has also published and continues to do so as an analyst and commentator in various international media. An interesting aspect of her most recent project is that the DFG project entitled Trust and Transparency in an Age of Surveillance is, of course, also one of the key concerns when one wants to understand the problems and opportunities of current transatlantic relations. The same applies to her most recent book, The Closure of the International System, How Institutions Create Political Equalities and Hierarchies, also published in 2020. Last but not least, our colleague here on the right is Omid Nouripour, a German citizen, as I learned this morning, Omid, since 2002. I knew that you and your family came from Iran at an early age of yours, and so you bring to this particular panel an additional perspective from an additional important background as far as the shape and future of transatlantic relations is concerned. Omid Nouripour is a member of the German Parliament. He is a member, or has been a member of the party Bündnis 90 Die Grünen, the Greens, since 1996. Has been the chairman of the Green Youth movement here in Hessen, as well as a member of the party's Federal Executive Committee. For our purposes today, it is of particular relevance that Omid Nouripour has a lot of experience both in security and defense policy as well as foreign policy. He is the foreign policy speaker currently of Bündnis 90 Die Grünen. He is a member of the Committee on Foreign Affairs, as well as the Committee on Human Rights and Humanitarian Aid. And he's also a member of many prestigious transatlantic institutions and associations, such as the Atlantikbrücke and the Deutsche Atlantische Gesellschaft. So as you can see, this is a very illustrious panel. I think we should probably just proceed in the order as the colleagues here are listed in the program, which would mean that we would start with Michael Kimmage, then Omid Nouripour, Constanze Stelzenmüller, and Lora Viola. Michael, the floor is yours. Welcome again.
So much, first of all, for the invitation to participate and also for the very kind and generous introduction. I'd like to make 3 points, which I'll outline by way of introduction and conclude with 2 recommendations. The first is that there's a basic and enduring commonality of interest in the transatlantic relationship on matters of security. The second is that the relationship is based as much on culture as it is on interests, and that in 2020, this is quite a significant problem. And third, that culture needs much more attention in relation to security questions within the transatlantic relationship. Though in this case, by culture, I mean high culture or intellectual culture, as opposed to the popular culture that was discussed in the first panel of this conference. The recommendations that I'll offer will sketch a kind of balance, or at least a proposed balance, between change and tradition in this very important relationship. So first point on security. The common interests are really very considerable and range from the vast commercial relationship between Europe and the United States to contending with China and its formidable integration of diplomacy, economic statecraft, and military strategy, to dealing with Russia, with which the West has almost no common ground at this point, to the long-lasting transnational problems of pandemics and climate change. It is true, of course, that President Trump has tried to break away from Europe, to stigmatize various European leaders, Angela Merkel especially, to minimize the American security commitment, and to weaken the European Union. But even he has been constrained in these agendas by the many national interests that stand in the way of a radical, or one might say a genuine, America First policy, and not least is he constrained by his own administration's notion of great power competition between Russia and China, because in this competition, Europe can only be an ally. So by his own standards, there are ways in which he compels the United States and Europe to be partners and allies. Were Joe Biden to be elected, and I'm struck by how little conversation we've had in this conference about Joe Biden, Trump has his unique talent for dominating people's attention, and one might add, just by way of balance, that Biden has been leading in the polls since January. So he's worth a careful look, I think, by all of us at this conference. Were Biden to be elected, Europe would once again be, quote, the partner of first resort. This is to borrow the title of a forthcoming book from the Brookings Institute Press by David McCain, who is the director of the State Department's Office of Policy Planning in Obama's second term. In other words, Biden would affirm the deep affinity of interest between Europe and the United States. Secondly, culture. Interests are, of course, not the whole story. The transatlantic relationship, launched in 1945, was rooted as much in culture as it was in hard interests. Focusing only on the American side of the story, one can say that the transatlantic security relationship began in the idea of the West, or of Western civilization, as one would have said in the 1940s. The West encompassed die Werte der Aufklärung, as Ambassador Shahiot put it in his keynote address yesterday, speaking about the future of the transatlantic relationship. In its ideal form, this idea stood for limited government, individual liberty, and the rule of law. And it was something, in the eyes of Americans in the 1940s, at least of policymakers, something that Europe and the United States shared. To cite only one example, we have Secretary of State George Marshall speaking before the House Foreign Affairs Committee in January 1948. I quote, "Left to their own resources, there will be no escape by Europeans from economic distress so intense, social discontent so violent, political confusion so widespread, and hope of the future so shattered that the historical base of Western civilization will take a new form in the image of the tyranny we fought to destroy in Germany." In the language of this conference, Western civilization is the antidote to political polarization. These kinds of quotes can be modified ad infinitum from the 1940s and 1950s. Now, however, the phrase Western civilization is impossibly old-fashioned. It has been subjected to serious challenges from the left and the right, and it no longer has a proper home in American culture. On the left, and this is summarizing very radically, Europe can be politically attractive, it often is, but the West signifies white supremacy, the legacy of colonialism, and an obstacle to multiculturalism. The West is tied tragically to the figure of Christopher Columbus, to whom there are countless statues in the United States, several of which were taken down after the killing of George Floyd this summer, in a symbolic break with the European past. On the right, there is Donald Trump, of course, described during the Republican nominating convention this past August as, quote unquote, the bodyguard of Western civilization. But he's clearly a man who rejects die Werte der Aufklärung, whether these values are scientific expertise, as Ambassador Chariot explained yesterday evening, or the rules-based to the main aspiration of American foreign policy. And although Trump has his followers in Europe, he is a cultural affront to the transatlantic relationship, such that it does not necessarily matter that he has increased spending on NATO, allowed 2 new countries into NATO during his first term, and sent lethal weapons to Ukraine. All of this is, I think, outweighed by the cultural damage he's doing so daily to the US-European relationship. Finally, my third point, culture demands much more of our attention. It is really no less consequential than what Germany decides to do on Nord Stream 2, or what the United States does or does not do about climate change. And so in that spirit of culture's importance, 2 recommendations. And these are American-oriented. There are other recommendations we could discuss perhaps afterwards that might matter to European policymakers or European audiences. First, there's no return to the West of the 1940s. The United States is a profoundly multicultural society. It must honor the various rights revolutions of the post-war period, both in its culture and its foreign policy. And where the West intersected with imperialism and colonialism in both European and American history, this must be rethought, moderating the arrogance of the past by adopting a global purview and by working toward the universality of human rights. Obviously, this is a work in progress in the fall of 2020, but I think I'm confident in saying that multiculturalism is the story of the American future. Secondly, there's every reason to retain the best of the West, even if it's called something different now, the best of what the West had once signified. And this is precisely the Enlightenment legacy that follows from the French and American revolutions. An avid reader of Immanuel Kant, Woodrow Wilson tried to update this legacy after World War I, seeking an international system guided more by deliberation than conflict. And the most enduring successes of the Wilsonian vision had their beginnings in the rubble of post-war Europe, in the diminishment of authoritarian rule in Europe, and in the love affair that the United States began at that time with alliances. First and foremost among them, the Transatlantic Alliance. So my conclusion, to try to address the main topic of the conference, if the transatlantic relationship founders or falls apart in the next few years, and this is the Geteilte Zukunft of the conference's title, the German title at least, if it diverges in the English language title, this will be against the practical interests of both Europe and the United States. Therefore, the reason for the collapse of this long-standing and very successful relationship, if it happens, will have to be sought in the field of culture, and in cultural shifts that turn friends into competitors, and unpleasant as it is for me to contemplate, may turn competitors over time into enemies. By contrast, if the transatlantic relationship is to endure, it will also be because of a shift in culture, and that's the spirit of my 2 concluding recommendations. So I'd like to end on that note.
Well, thank you very much. Omid Nouripour.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a great pleasure to see a lot of friends again, especially Constanze. I didn't see Constanze for definitely too long. To be honest, it's a little bizarre to sit here sitting so close to the moderator and seeing him through this piece of glasses, which is giving me a mixed feeling of co-working in a call center or getting a visitor in a jail. The question is, who is the prisoner here? But let me start the serious part with an anecdote. One of the first executive orders which has been signed by President Trump was the so-called Muslim ban, and I was affected of. As I'm a double citizen, I'm born Iranian, and I just can't get rid of that citizenship no matter what I do. And so I was banned, and my visa was revoked. And this was a bizarre moment, also for my work, not only emotionally, because I'm the vice president of the U.S. caucus in the German Bundestag. So I was told that I can't go there anymore. And I got a bunch of calls from journalists asking me if it was a huge mistake to call myself a transatlanticist. And the answer definitely was, and still is, no. Because to me, this friendship is not destroyable by nobody, neither in the Oval Office nor in the Chancellery, because it's a P2P thing. It's a question of people working together based on the same values we are sharing. And I saw a bunch of people, Lora especially, who just left their offices and then camped in airports in the United States fighting for people who was banned the way I was, whose families were divided and so on. And this is the very tough stand I come from. So the question of transatlantic relations is not a question of politics. It's a question of people to people. Now, of course, we have this huge stress. And I would say that, and I fully agree with the quote I just heard, that this is the biggest crisis of the relations for the last 70 years. I think it's quite complicated to get back, and the Europeans have to understand that no matter who's going to win these elections, there won't be a go back to the status quo ante. But there had been this other quote given by President Roosevelt then, saying that we never should miss a good crisis. And this is a very good crisis because it's a huge one. I think there are a couple of things, a couple of homeworks for two sides if we want to use this situation here. I would love to point out two on each side. I think for the Europeans, there are two things to understand. The first one is we have to understand that the United States is not a mix of the East and the West Coast, but there are a lot of people there who voted for Trump because they are in deep need of change. And I think making America great again is a conservative version of change and hope. I was in West Virginia in July 2017, I think, and I went to McDowell County. It was my choice because McDowell County was the county in the entire nation having the highest rate of Trump voters. I think 94% of the people voted for Trump. I saw so much poverty, and I'm as a foreign policy guy, I travel around all the time seeing misery. To be honest, I couldn't imagine to see so much poverty and misery there. The headline of the tour I got was Poverty Tour. In McDowell County, 1960 had 101,000 people living there. The inhabitant number now is 19,000. They do not have one single doctor in the entire county. They do not have one single dentist there. And these people was told that they're going to be changed. And this is why they voted for Trump. I saw the highest official of the Democratic Party who told me that, of course, he voted for Trump. And when I asked him why, he said, I voted for Trump because we had a choice between a man who's promising the pie in the sky. He said, I vote for me and I'm going to bring back the coal miners' jobs. And of course he didn't. And to be honest, we didn't believe him that he's going to bring back the jobs. But the alternative was a lady who's not even showing any compassion for our situation. So we have to understand that it was not Trump winning these elections, but the establishment losing it. And this is a huge split, to be honest, which is not that unique in the United States. We know such a phenomenon also in our country, and we have to learn from that because it can get worse. But to be honest, I'm definitely not famous for being a fan of President Trump, but the first thing is we have to understand why he has been elected. The second thing is, when it comes to security, no matter who is president in the United States, we have some homeworks. And we didn't go after them we didn't do them for the last decades. I'm not talking about the 2%. I'm not a fan of the 2% because they are not specific. This is not about just spending money because politicians decide a level of or an amount of cash we have to spend. But of course, we are not able, in this moment, we are not able to evacuate the German armed forces from Afghanistan without American assistance. This is madness. The other side, because I want to keep it very brief. The other side of the pond has two homeworks. Also, the first one is ignoring our sovereignty, and this is what happened for the last years. We saw there are a lot of examples for that. JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, is one of them. But the worst one, to be honest, is Nord Stream. I'm fighting Nord Stream from the first moment. We, as my party does, But this is definitely not acceptable to see American side putting secondary sanctions on German ports in Mecklenburg-Vorpommern. This is a violation of our sovereignty. We just cannot cannot accept. We wouldn't accept that no matter who is doing it. And we definitely cannot accept it from the American side also. The second thing is, of course, there is a huge element of soft power here, and George W. Bush was not that good. Obama was much better. The speeches he delivered were more understandable for a European audience also. But this is a huge difference to have a Twitter account spreading lies all the time, destructing democratic culture of debate, than having soft or hard power, or a lack of awareness for the need of soft power. And I just can't remind anybody that in the last election campaigns in the United States, in every single speech, the President Trump had one part just spreading lies about Germany. And this is definitely not a good term of friendship. So the second homework, it's not that difficult, I think, for the other side. It's just to come back to a culture of discussion and a debate which is much more friendly. Of course, we have a huge systemic rivalry, not only with China, but I think the rivalry with China is the most important one. And I definitely agree that this is the moment where democracies have to stand together and understand what that is about us and about our way of life. This is what we are trying to we have to defend. You just mentioned my origins. In these days, it's getting tough and tougher for me to look at what's going on in Iran, because there are a lot of people now being executed and tortured, and there are people who are dying now in the prisons because they just do not manage any COVID there. This is, of course, non-democracies are not Iran, but if there's just one system on earth who can prevent you to get there, these are democracies. And as a person who had the experience with unfreedom, I just can tell to anybody that these freedoms just did not fall from heaven and are under attack. And this attack is a very serious one, maybe the most serious one for the last 30 years. And if you want to defend, if you want to contain, and if we want to keep our democracies and our way of life, we have to stand together as democracies. This is not a question of EU and the United States. It should include Canada, China, definitely not, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and a couple of other democracies. This is the moment to come together. If we miss that, it's going to be much harder to win, or at least to defend ourselves in the systemic rivalry.
Thank you very much. Next on our list is Constanze Stelzenmüller. Please, Constanze.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me well? Yeah? Good. Excellent. First of all, thank you for inviting me to speak to you. I agree with Omid Nouripour, who is an old friend, lovely to see you, that this is a singularly strange set of circumstances under which we find ourselves. And yes, I'm sorry for you as you sit there between your glass walls. I'm sitting at my dining room table in Washington, D.C., while somebody is mowing the lawn outside next door. And I also feel, seeing my own face reflected in those monitors, this reminds me of the movie New York Stories. I don't know whether any of you has seen that. It's a collection of shorter films about New York, and the segment made by Woody Allen ends with the image of his mother appearing to him over the skyscrapers of New York in a huge, just the face of his mother is sort of in a disembodied form, floating above the skyscrapers. And that is what this looks to me right now. So I'm sorry you have to go through that, and particularly that the speakers have the monitors behind them. I hope you have one before you as well, so you can actually see what we're saying. Anyway, Also, I just want to say I have a connection to Bad Homburg, which is one of the reasons why I first said yes when Gunther Hellmann invited me, who is, of course, also an old friend. My grandparents lived there for all their post-war life. So for me, as a diplomat's child, throughout my childhood, adolescence, and later as a student, this was the place where I went after landing in Frankfurt on my way to somewhere else or to see my grandparents. So I'm even more sorry that I can't be with you physically because it's such a familiar little town, and I love it deeply. For me, that was it embodied Germany when I was a little girl. However, on the subject at hand, it's very kind of you, Gunther, to call me one of the top 5. That's really sweet of you. I'm reminded by Michael Kimmage's very interesting introduction, emphasizing the importance of culture and the relationship, that while I am now an analyst of foreign and security policy, I started out as a constitutional lawyer. And in fact, I wrote my German doctoral thesis on direct democracy in American constitutional law, a topic which I thought I would never need again in my working life, and which, to my surprise, and I have to say distress, is turning out to be extremely useful in the current predicament that we find ourselves in as Friends of America living in the eye of the storm in this country, which I think it has to be said is living in the most severe constitutional crisis since the Civil War. And I say that with great seriousness. I have, because of my father's profession as a diplomat, lived here in Washington as a child in the 70s, after the Kent State shootings in the middle of the Vietnam War and at the beginning of the Watergate crisis. And I went to graduate school at Harvard in the late 80s, in the outgoing years of the Reagan Revolution. So I think I can say that I remember from my own experience living in this country, sometimes of great tension, of great cultural tension, but I have never, ever seen anything like this. And I would not be honest if I didn't admit that this fills me with foreboding. And why is this different? Why is this moment different from anything that has gone before since the Civil War? Because we are seeing for the first time since then a questioning of the fundamental principles of the American constitutional order by those in power. This is what is new. This is not a fringe movement. This is not the hard right that sort of simmered along in pockets of American culture for so many decades. It is now in power. And the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg last night has brought not just the president's favorite issue, law and order, to the forefront of this last stretch of the election campaign, but also the issue of culture war. This is exactly the terrain where the president and his supporters want to fight the Democrats. And it is a terrain in which ethno-nationalists, a very strong anti-enlightenment strain, and also, oddly, something that we haven't seen in quite a while, ultra-Catholicism, also play a very strong role. The second point I want to make is that 6 weeks out from the election day, it's not clear at this point, despite the fact that Biden is apparently the front runner in most polls, it's not clear what the outcome of this election will be. The race is tight in key states like Florida, and with the passing of Justice Ginsburg, I think it's possible that it will become tighter still. And like Omid, I am wondering whether Germany is prepared for a second Trump administration, or in fact for a Biden administration in which the other side of the aisle, will continue its cultural opposition in ways that will make the Tea Party and the Freedom Caucus of a decade ago look like amateurs, look like, you know, to use an American expression, Sunday morning softball practice. In other words, regardless of the outcome of this election, the culture war framing will persist, will continue, and will be, and I think will dominate even the most technical of foreign and security policy conversations. And that is something we need to understand and need to prepare ourselves for. And based on my impressions, my conversations with European officials, I'm not sure that we are. Just to be even-handed here, I want to point out something I think we all know, but it's worth leaving that marker here in this conversation. It's not just the American side where this is happening. In Europe too, we're seeing cultural wars frame political conversations. There are within NATO, within the Transatlantic Alliance, at least two governments where the illiberal authoritarians are in power. And I'm talking, of course, about Hungary and about Poland. And while in other countries, including in Germany, the populists, the illiberal authoritarians have generally not had a very good pandemic, it's not clear to me that they have lost the battle. I think that we are at best at the end of the beginning of the pandemic shining a bright light on the flaws of our own systems, of our own democracies. And as the social and economic cleavages that it highlights deepen, I think we will see the populists gaining ground again. So, and that, which brings me to my final point, without even having talked about the foreign and security policy challenges that we all have to deal with. A situation in which, it seems to me, many Americans, and this includes even Republicans, understand that in a world of great power competition and a reduction of America's absolute power on the global stage, in the conflict with its main challengers, Russia and China, requires allies for leverage. And a situation, conversely, where the worsening of the security environment around Europe requires greater European capabilities, ability to act, ability to, shall we say, counter the aggression, the assertiveness of our challengers, not just in our neighborhood, but within the European Union and within our own countries. The aggressive acquisition of assets, companies, individuals, digital and physical infrastructure. Omid Nouripour mentioned Nord Stream 2. We could add the 5G networks. All of that requires a European capability to assert its sovereignty, its capability to act, which I'm not sure we're seeing yet, and for which it would be useful to have America by our side. Let me end by saying that I think there is no other way of describing this as the worst foreign policy and security environment that Europe has seen since the end of not just the Cold War, but since the end of World War II. I think we are woefully underprepared for it. And the earlier we understand that, the better we will be able to do something about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Constanze. And finally, Professor Viola.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me here today. As the last speaker, I guess it's my responsibility to bring the optimistic note into the discussion. Unfortunately, I won't be doing that. I'll stick to the more pessimistic side of things. I think that's where we are today. Trump has been called the great disruptor, and true to label, his rhetoric and decisions have contributed to political uncertainty, especially in the transatlantic relationship. And I happen to agree with those who say it's naive to think that when Trump leaves office, whenever that is, that the transatlantic relationship or foreign policy more broadly will not simply return to what it used to be. I think that it would be naive to think that. What I think we really need to focus on are the deeper structural changes that Trump is accelerating, perhaps, but not directly causing. Whatever happens in November, I think there are a few trends that will stay with us and shape the future of transatlantic relations, and there are three that I'd like to briefly raise here that I think are important. First is the global shift in the distribution of power, and especially the rise of China. Second is the US's enduring ambivalence towards multilateralism, and I'll tell you why I don't think this will go away. And third are changes in domestic coalitions within the US, and in particular, something we haven't yet talked about, changes to the traditional elite consensus on foreign policy. So let me go through these briefly with you. So the first one is a global power shift. As we've already heard, the transatlantic relationship and America's position in the world have been undergoing a slow transformation since the end of the Cold War. The change isn't a sudden one, even though Trump has made it look dramatic. During the Cold War, NATO had a clear purpose shared by all the members, was to deter and defend against the Soviet Union. Since the end of the Cold War, members have not found a stable consensus on what NATO ought to be doing or where it ought to be doing it. And in the meantime, the US's strategic interests have shifted away from Europe. Asia has become the region most central to US strategic interests. China, as an economic giant with increasing political leverage, is the US's main strategic concern, and that increases the importance of the US's relationship to allies outside of Europe in Asia. Now, Europe and NATO are not unimportant to the US-China relationship, but they are also not central to it. And this situation, I think, is putting pressure on the transatlantic relationship in at least two ways. First, as US strategic interests shift away from Europe, the US's commitment to Europe is naturally weakening, regardless of Trump's particular politics. And here, Europe faces a difficult balancing act. On the one hand, European states have a real interest in keeping the US's security guarantee through NATO because there is no other viable plan on the table right now. And without the US, as we've already heard, NATO would not be able to continue as it is. And this means that Europe and Germany really has to spend more on defense and to address the burden sharing issue. On the other hand, Europe also needs to rethink, even more seriously than it has so far, about how to reduce dependence on the United States and how to build its own defense capabilities, including European procurement, which requires an industrial base, training, research and development, and integration of military forces. Now, the second consequence of the US-China rivalry for the transatlantic relationship is that Europe will become increasingly squeezed between the US and China, putting it in a very difficult position with difficult strategic choices ahead. Europe has close economic ties to both countries, and we already see Europe in the middle under pressure. And I think we see this most strongly in the area of digital technology. I think that the US-China rivalry will play out as a conflict to determine political and economic dominance over the digital networks that shape the global economy. This is 5G, this is Huawei, this is TikTok most recently. And for this, as we've just heard, Europe is not prepared. The second trend that I think goes well beyond Trump and Biden is the US's enduring ambivalence towards multilateralism. We've heard again and again that Trump is withdrawing from international agreements. He's withdrawing US global leadership, pulling out from multilateral institutions, and it's true. We all know the cases. Trump has withdrawn the US from the Paris Accord, the Iran nuclear deal. He's threatened to withdraw from NATO, threatened to withdraw from the WTO. He said he has an intention to withdraw from the World Health Organization. But as bad as that sounds, I think it's important to remember, and I've heard it a few times here misstated as well, that historically the US has never been as strongly committed to multilateral cooperation as is typically assumed. Remember that during the George W. Bush administration, we had similar debates over the end of multilateralism and the US's undermining of the liberal order. And in fact, compared to other advanced democracies, and especially to European countries, the US has generally been a laggard in ratifying international agreements well before Trump. I just name a few of them here. The US withdrew from or refused to ratify agreements such as the International Criminal Court, the Kyoto Treaty, the Ottawa Landmines Convention, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, the Convention on Biological Diversity, Convention on the Law of the Sea, and many more, all before Trump. Right? So if it's not Trump, then what explains the US's reluctance on multilateralism? And I think there is a pattern here. US presidents have generally understood that participation in multilateral institutions can be a powerful instrument of foreign policy and US influence, as long as the US has the power to set the terms or exempt itself when the constraints of those institutions become too costly. So in other words, the US is most willing to support multilateralism when its relative power is high and it can set the terms. And it becomes more reluctant as its relative power and influence declines. So consider that during the Cold War and the immediate post-Cold War period, the costs to the US to using large-scale multilateralism, like the World Trade Organization, were relatively low for the US because it had a broad alignment of interests between the US and countries in its sphere of influence, and European countries. And when goals and interests did diverge, the US was able to use its hard and soft power to push through its preferred outcomes. So I'm reminded of the 1980s, for example, with Reagan, when he sought to protect, much as Trump has tried to do, the US auto industry. Reagan asked Japan to voluntarily restrict its car exports to the US, and Japan did it. Today, the situation is different. We are in the midst of a global power shift in which a number of countries are gaining influence and leverage, while the US's ability to dominate multilateral institutions has declined. We see it in the deadlock at the World Trade Organization very clearly. It has become more difficult to reach agreement and more costly for the US to enforce consensus around its preferred outcomes. Now, if we extrapolate this argument, then we should expect US skepticism of multilateralism to grow stronger rather than weaker in the future, no matter who's president, because US leverage is decreasing. So I would expect someone like Joe Biden, and I think, in fact, this was already true of Obama, who are committed to multilateralism in principle, to in practice emphasize minilateral deals, bilateral deals with like-minded states. Okay, and this brings me to my third and final point on the changing domestic views on US foreign policy. I think that what we have seen in recent American foreign policy is a struggle to come to terms with America's changing role in the world, without there yet being any consensus on what the new vision should be. So Obama tried to articulate this adjustment with his pivot to Asia, or his leading from behind ideas, right? So two labels associated with Obama. Trump has done so with America First and his hard line on China. And Bernie Sanders had tried to introduce a progressive foreign policy that sees a much more limited role for the United States in global affairs. These different ideas are all a way to try to come to terms with the US's changing power position in the global structure, and also with changing domestic interests on US foreign policy. The US public has long been in favor of internationalism, and for the most part, it still is. But there is much less consensus today on what that internationalism should look like in practice. For instance, many more Americans today are skeptical of free trade agreements than they were in the past. Perhaps even more importantly, the long-standing elite consensus on foreign policy is also beginning to fragment. The foreign policy elite in the US have historically been committed to the idea that the US leadership is necessary for world order, right? And for that reason, that US primacy needed to be preserved and maintained. This consensus cut across party lines, and it has faced very little challenge, also very little intellectual challenge in academia. This is a school that Biden belongs to and that many traditional Republicans belong to. But a new generation of foreign policy thinkers is questioning the old liberal internationalism. People like Obama's former advisor on foreign policy, Ben Rhodes, or Bernie Sanders' foreign policy advisor, Dan Nexon, or Dan Bessner, and a number of other public intellectuals are right now, just over the last year or so, calling for something called a progressive foreign policy. This is the foreign policy equivalent of AOC or Bernie Sanders. It's a more left-wing foreign policy, and it's really interesting, I think, because it sees a much less dominant role for the United States on the global stage. And It's anti-militarist. It calls for a reduction in defense spending and a withdrawal of US troops. It is less pro-trade. It's more pro-labor. It is critical of globalization, and it's less committed to American primacy. It's a very different kind of foreign policy than the one the US has mostly pursued since the end of the Cold War. Now, if you look at the 2020 Democratic Party platform, it already reflects this move to the left on foreign policy. Okay, so to sum up, right now I think we see three different foreign policy visions emerging. One is the traditional liberal internationalist position that Biden himself represents, and that has been the basis, really, of the transatlantic partnership. The second is Trump's version of nationalist retrenchment. And the third is this new progressive vision that is gaining sway in the Democratic Party and among next-generation foreign policy thinkers. Now, I'm not sure which of these three will predominate over the next few years, but I think that it's important to note the fragmentation of views here. And I think it indicates that Europe should not expect the US to easily and simply return to the kind of partner it has been in the past. I think we will continue to see volatility in US foreign policy no matter who's president as it adjusts to its position in the world, and Europe will need to come to terms with that. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to all four panelists, and I'm pretty sure that you share the view that these experts have provided a lot of evidence and additional arguments why there is indeed a fundamental crisis in transatlantic relations. I was stunned, though, that culture played such a tremendously important role in the presentation, at least of Constanze Stelzenmüller and Michael Kimmage, to some extent, Omid Nouripour's reference to people-to-people contacts. Because the title of this panel is Transatlantic Security, and normally I would have expected the more kind of a realist type of analysis which Professor Viola has been providing, which Michael was saying, I think more in a normatively normative sense of appealing to what you called considerable security interests, Michael, where I think most people in the room probably would share the normative side of things. But in terms of analysis, realism is normally the theory that dominates security analysis. I'm just struggling to see the kinds of convergences in terms of common interests that I think at least Professor Viola was putting in question. So my first question to all of you, and you're invited to respond to each other if you take issue, is with reference to the title of the very conference here. There seems to be a lot that divides us today, and the crisis is deep indeed. But I'm curious to get your views as to one or two top areas, trends, analytically, not normatively, analytically, where you think there is indeed shared interests of Germans/Europeans on the one hand and Americans on the other. And that includes what Constanze was, I think, rightly referring to the commonalities that we see within societies and the divisions that we face within societies. Just think about how the AfD in Germany looks at Trump and how the political establishment looks at Trump, and Putin, for that matter. So if you could just perhaps just list your one or two top shared interests analytically that Europeans and Americans still have. I'm just curious. And please feel free to also join in terms of starting an argument with others on the panel if you agree or disagree. Omid, first.
Would love to agree and disagree first, then answer to your question. I agree with everything I've heard, but the disagreement. I want to underline the agreement with that, what Constanze just said on that the question of this kind of cultural clash is not a not a US specialty. I learned from her who Phyllis Schlafly is. She once told me that Phyllis Schlafly is the symbol, or has been a symbol figure, and it's some kind of a founder of the anti-feminism in the United States, telling to her to our people that feminism would prevent ladies from being happy and because feminism is getting them out of the kitchen. Okay, this is Phyllis Schlafly. When she passed away, I think 3 years ago or 4 years ago. Last year, the German taxpayers paid a trip of a colleague of mine from the Nazi Party in the German Bundestag, who traveled to St. Louis, contributing to a speech to the memorial for Phyllis Schlafly. So I underline what Constanze said, and we have to take a deeper look at the networks they have and how they support each other, because this is huge. You have three very, very brief disagreements. The first one is everybody's talking about November. I just can hope and pray that we're going to have a consolidated result of the elections in November. Second, the question of are we prepared or not? To be honest, we got a lot of people telling us after the last election, general election in the United States, that Europe was not prepared. But to be honest, nobody could tell us until yet how we could have been prepared. And I have no idea how to prepare for 4 more years. But what I know is that we have to take a better look at that, what's going on and why Trump could be reelected. This is absolutely important to understand the mechanisms of this, and I see a lack of that in Europe. And the last one is to the optimistic view of Professor Viola. I admire, and I tried before to be an optimist also here, but I do not agree with your comparison with the traditional American reluctance to multilateralism, and that's what's going on now. Because there are a couple of differences. One is the Americans withdraw now from the United Nations and then the institutions, the Chinese come in and take over, and it's gonna last. They're gonna stay there. They won't go out. So this is the one huge difference, and the second huge difference is we had a reluctance of the Americans when we had the last Greek-Turkish war. Both of them already had been members of the NATO then, but everybody knows that in the end of the day, there is someone in Washington who can prevent the escalation of that. Now, this is not a reluctance; it's just withdrawal. That means that at the end of the day, if there's going to be the next war, and we are not that far away from that in the eastern part of the Mediterranean. There won't be no one. There is no cavalry coming or even calling from Washington helping. Now, the question of what we share, I would say there are two things. And to be honest, the core of that things we share are external ones. One is, I referred to that already, China and the systemic rivalry and how to defend democracy. And the second one is NATO. If you talk to people in Europe, in my branch doing international politics, asking them what's the biggest task, the answer of anybody of them is keeping the European Union together. There is no way to keep the European Union together without reassurance for our partner countries in Central and Eastern Europe, who know that if there's if there would be a next fourth aggression of Russia after Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia, that the only entity who could help them, assist, and who could defend them is NATO. There are a lot of things with NATO I do not like, but the existence of NATO is something keeping us together in Europe. And if I do not mistake the American interest, it's also an American interest to not to give up NATO, but there is a collusion with the Russians, but I don't know.
Since you raised that issue, this was one of the questions I had on my list towards the end of the discussion we have up here. But since you raised it yourself, I'm just curious, and we'll also ask it to all four of you, and maybe you can just add to that. Since you hinted at the question whether we will have a normal transition, I'm just curious to get your bet. There have been reports, the Atlantic had a huge article recently about likely scenarios that Trump would not leave the White House. Just in terms of your bet, do you think that on the 20th of January we will have a normal transition, either him being re-elected and inaugurated, or Biden being elected and being recognized by the defeated candidate?
Everything I get from the electoral of the GOP is that there are too many people there who definitely would not accept a defeat. But I would love to hear the view of those who are next to that in DC. Maybe they know, they definitely have a better impression of that, what's going on, and maybe you can refer to that.
And this, of course, is also an issue with implications for transatlantic relations. Thanks, Omid. Please, and then we go to Washington.
Okay. Well, first of all, I am not a proponent of the realist school with international relations, but I would call myself a realist constructivist. I think that the role of ideas are tremendously important, and that's why I raised this shift in ideas in the United States, because I think that the changes that we're seeing do go beyond Trump, and that's what I wanted to underscore here. And in terms of, so there are a number of issues on the table. The first question about where are there areas of commonality, I think that is exactly what we need to find. And I think that, for example, there should be a lot of commonality and common interests on the issue of China. But I think that Europe hasn't really figured it out yet, right? So I think that we see Europe getting ready to be firmer with China and aligning with some of Trump's harder rhetoric on economic relations with China. But I think that the two allies haven't really found common ground yet on how to deal with China. And I think this is worrying, especially for Europe, because Europe has dependencies in both towards both economies. I think another really important issue that I also brought up is digital technology. I think here, Europe and the United States have common interests, and they also have a lot that divide them, different views on privacy, for example, privacy rights, data protection rights. But I think that there's a lot more commonality than either Europe or US has towards China on these issues. And I think a lot more needs to be done to work those out and to really move forward on that with policy. So I think those are really two very big issues. On the last set of questions about the transition, I think that we will have a difficult transition. I think that that is what most people predict. It's hard to predict right now, but there are at least a number of scenarios in which the transition after the election will be difficult. And one of them, obviously, is if we have a discrepancy between the popular vote and the Electoral College. Now we have the added complexity that, in the 2000 election, the Supreme Court was called upon to rule, and now we have a Supreme Court that's also essentially in turmoil since the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, in terms of, it could be potentially divided, right, without someone to be the dividing vote. So I think that makes everything much more complicated in terms of transition. And I think that this means a lot more volatility coming up over the next few months. And the question is, how long will this volatility last? Right? So I think that we'll have the volatility no matter who wins. And I think that if Biden wins, the volatility could be longer. And the question is if it goes past January. I mean, January 20th, the United States has to have a president, right? That legally it has to have a president. The question is, what exactly will that look like, and what kind of political damage will be done in the meantime?
But eventually you would say there will be a Gore moment where he finally accepted that he had lost.
Do you mean, will Trump leave? Will he actually leave office? I think Trump will leave. I think that there will be a lot of contestation in any case. There will be legal contestation, and the question is how quickly. So Al Gore, right, he's often complimented for his statesmanship, right, that he decided for the unity of the republic, it was important to stop contesting, right? And I don't think that we can expect that of Trump, but I don't think he'll just refuse to leave.
Thanks. We go to Washington and start with Constanze and then with Michael.
All right. Thank you very much. I thought this was fascinating, and I'm really grateful that Professor Viola gave us this overview of the positions among the Democrats, because I think that that's very important. Let me just add to that. And again, because of even if Biden wins, there are going to be some very, very hardline conservatives in Congress. And I think key among those are Senators Cotton and Senators Hawley, who will be mounting a fundamentalist opposition against whatever foreign and security policy the Democrats in the White House will be trying to execute. And I think there it's important to say that Professor Viola is exactly right in saying that there has been a fundamental shift, even among hardline conservatives, in the view of America's relative power in the world. The irony of the hard right in America, which treats globalization as an ideology and as a false belief, calling it globalism, is that they acknowledge the reality of globalization even as they preach decoupling. This is a really important point. And they make it clear that they understand that this interdependence has reduced America's absolute and relative power vis-a-vis its main challengers, but also vis-a-vis Europe. But the logic here for the conservatives, and I have found this most clearly and straightforwardly expressed in a piece by not Hal Brands, by Wes Mitchell and by Elbridge Colby. Bridge Colby, who wrote the national security, the national defense strategy, and Wes Mitchell, who was the top Europe official in the first 2 years of the Trump administration, where they write that that this situation, a relatively diminished America facing existential competition, particularly from China, requires allies for leverage. And that therefore America will need to make allies fall into line. And then they write, quote unquote, this is the actual quote, with real pressure if need be. In other words, while the Transatlantic Alliance may be seen as an encumbrance, as an annoyance, even the American right understands that it needs allies. And again, I think we are unprepared for that. That's my first point. My second point, the second point that I want to make is that, and this is one that my Brookings colleague, Tom Wright, has explained masterfully, in my view, in his biweekly columns in The Atlantic, is the debate within the centrist camp of the Democrats, and this is just putting another sort of additional layer of complexity in what Professor Viola has already said, which is that within the centrists there are people like Biden whose worldview is very much still that of the internationalist, as much multilateralist as possible. American camp. And then there are reformers who feel that America needs to take a much clearer stance against the assertiveness and the aggression of both Russia and China. Again, that I think would see a Washington asking Europeans for support in ways that I think Europeans now, and particularly Berlin, would feel extremely uncomfortable supplying. And finally, maybe a last point on Omid's reference to Phyllis Schlafly. If I may make a pop cultural reference here, since we've talked about culture so much, there is a Hulu series called Mrs. America about Phyllis Schlafly. And for those of you who don't know her, Phyllis Schlafly was the woman who pretty much single-handedly, on the American right, brought down the Equal Rights Amendment. The Equal Rights Amendment was a liberal feminist project, an amendment to the US Constitution, explicitly guaranteeing the application of the principle of equal rights to women and forbidding discrimination of women. And at the time that Phyllis Schlafly undertook her campaign, it was I think a nationwide assumption, and I remember this from my own childhood, that the Equal Rights Amendment would pass and was as we say in German, a Selbstläufer, something that would essentially run itself. It was a foregone conclusion. And the reason that this series is so fascinating is that it explains with, I think, a great deal of political and sociological accuracy how the feminist movement in America, how divided it was, how it managed to act at cross purposes to itself, and how Phyllis Schlafly used early methods of mailing lists, calling, building networks across the country well before the existence of the internet to drum up a grassroots opposition that the country had, the likes of which the country had not seen. In other words, she was a genius political organizer, and she tapped into a groundswell of dissatisfaction that had not been recognized by liberal elites. And I think in that sense, this is an object lesson for us today. And I just want to make a final point here. The anniversary of German reunification last year, the anniversary of the fall of the wall last year, produced, I think, for the first time in Germany's post-Cold War history, not just a swath of political, sociological, economic analyses of the consequences of the fall of the wall for Eastern Germany and for Germany as a whole, but also, I think, for the first time, a sense of more critical self-awareness, very, very much removed from the, dare I say, somewhat complacent triumphalism of the first 2 decades, and an understanding of just how enormous the costs of social and political transformation had been for Eastern Germany. And that this is a legacy that we have still not fully come to terms with, both and particularly in its negative political aspects. In other words, what Omid described about his travels in America, I am seeing some of my East German journalist and analyst friends describing about their current travels in the 5 Eastern German states. And I think that we Germans have had, or particularly we West Germans, and I'm one of them, have had a remarkable blind spot as far as this is concerned. And of course, it is a cultural blindness that extends as well to the questions of why people voted for the ultra-conservatives in Poland and in Hungary and elsewhere. And I think, in other words, before we point at America, we do well to examine our own culture wars and to take them seriously for what they are, which is a fundamental questioning of the inheritance of the Enlightenment and of the post-World War constitutional consensus on liberal democracy in Europe and in Germany. Thank you.
Constanze, can we also get your assessment of the normal transition question?
Oh, sure. Yes, I forgot about it. It's very briefly. Look, I would. This is something. I mean, I obviously worry about this, but I also think that there is a lot of smoke there, and it's important not to think that the fire is as large as the smoke. It's still on a serious possibility for there to be a very clear Biden win, in which case the normal rules apply. There will be a transition. There may be resentment, there may be opposition, but the moving van for the current inhabitants of the White House will come, and it will start packing. And there will be an inauguration in January 2021. What I'm a little more worried about is an unclear situation, not least because of all the drama about mail-in ballots, of the type that we saw in 2000, when Bush and Gore ran against each other, and which I have very unpleasant memories of because I was still working as a journalist, and I spent several nights up at my newspaper trying to make sense of this. And it took weeks and weeks and weeks until it was finally decided by the Supreme Court. That's a possibility. But that's a political conflict. It's not conflict on the streets. And I would warn all of us against assuming the worst, which is some kind of a, breakdown of public order, civil war in the streets, and so on. That strikes me as an unwarranted over-dramatization of and the least likely possibility. Thank you.
Oh, thanks, Michael.
So I think Washington speaks in one voice on this issue of the election. Let me just add 3 very short points on that. I wouldn't underestimate the American appetite for normalcy at the moment. And that's a pandemic appetite in addition to a sort of Trump-era appetite. And normalcy would include, I think, a normal transition. So there's some degree, I think, of popular pressure for the zealots on both sides to go into the background and for normalcy to come forward. Secondly, Trump is a coward. He talks big. He's got an extraordinary bully pulpit as president, but he often behaves in ways that betray real sort of weakness. I don't think he's really up to the job of becoming a Vladimir Putin. It's tough to become an autocrat. It's not easy. And I don't think Trump has what it takes, thank God. And thirdly, I think Trump is still very unpopular personally among the elites of the Republican Party. And I would include Lindsey Graham and Mitch McConnell in this, even though they don't, sort of separate themselves at all from the president now. But I think that there are lots of Republicans who would jump at the chance to, in effect, get rid of Trump. Although what they would need for that is an electoral result that shows that he's basically unpopular. So that is, of course, a key variable. To go back to your earlier questions about interest, let me just identify 2 and speak for the State Department in exile, certainly not for the Trump administration on these 2 points. I think that from an American perspective, a key European interest is the success of the European Union. It's a great asset to American foreign policy. It keeps the peace in Europe. It spreads democratic norms. There's a reason why the U.S. was so supportive of this project from the beginning. And in this sense, when it comes to multilateralism and different, sort of wings and arguments of the foreign policy elite, I think Democrats now, may have some questions about America's role in the world and maybe rethinking things. But one thing they're very enthusiastic about is the European Union. And that was true for Barack Obama. It would be true for Joe Biden. It would be true even for the 20, 25-year-old staffers in the national security apparatus of a Biden administration, if there is one. And I think that that's a genuine American interest, and it seems to me not impossible that could be a sort of key thrust of a possible Biden administration. Secondly, I think the more important answer would take up China, but that's not my domain. So let me just say a few words about Russia. Europe and the U.S. have an interest in creating a reasonable Russia policy. We're not there yet in ways that are obvious, but I think that one has to caution against too much doom and gloom. NATO has been very successful in dealing with Russia since 2014. It's created a decent working relationship with Ukraine, which has retained its political pluralism and has not been overtaken by Russia, although parts of its territory have been invaded and annexed. But that policy has not worked so badly. And, there's the dog that hasn't barked with NATO since 2014. Russia has not crossed NATO borders. It has not gone to war with the Baltics. And maybe this sounds like science fiction, but this has been stuff that people have been worried about for the last 6 years. And in that sense, I think NATO is still doing what it was intended to do. It's a superb defensive alliance, and it's working. And it's an interest of the United States, I would say, to really keep that, keep that alliance working. And of course, we could go to Greece and Turkey and to the southern challenges for NATO and to migration and to all kinds of things that would raise tensions. But I think joint U.S.-European policy toward Russia is basically working at the moment. NATO is a key part of that. And on both sides, there's sort of an interest in keeping it that way. There are some things that Trump has not destroyed, at least so far.
Well, thank you very much. Before we open up, I have a final question based on your response to the last round. As far as these key shared interests are concerned. And surprisingly or not, NATO and China did pop up essentially in all. I assume, Constanze, that you would not disagree that these are key issues to be addressed and that they continue to be of shared interest for both Europeans and Americans. Now, in that context, Professor Viola said that, and I quote, we need to find commonalities as far as China is concerned. And I think that was put it properly in the sense that we somehow agree that China is important for both of us, but in different ways. It's not filling the function that Russia filled in the old days for the Europeans, because it's much farther away, and the kind of threat that China poses is different than the Russian threat from the old days and even in contemporary times. So in that sense, one of the questions that I would want to raise for the final round from the podium here is, where should we look to find these commonalities as far as China is concerned on both sides of the Atlantic? And which ones do you believe we might find more quickly in order to address what I heard Dan Hamilton, another excellent transatlanticist analyst, just recently say, that Europeans are not really prepared for a Biden administration and the kinds of demands a Biden administration will put towards Europe as far as China is concerned. So it's a very different type of challenge that Europeans would face in that regard. And the second question relates to the other main element, and I fundamentally agree with that. I think Omid raised that, but I think all the others put it in different ways, that NATO is indeed essential in a way that many of us here in Germany don't seem to realize fully enough. In my assessment, the fact that NATO continues to be of central importance, and I think you hinted at it, but it didn't come out as clearly as I think it is. Maybe you disagree, but let me try it. I think from a German perspective, NATO is essential because it helps reassure our European allies in a way that it has done in the past. That's the old classical pacifier function of America's role in Europe. And this is becoming ever more important, in my assessment, if and to the extent that Germany is moving into a leadership position within the European Union. I'm not sure whether the German political class is fully aware of this dimension. When I listen to Foreign Minister Maas at some points, I mean, his structural fundamental criticism of the Trump administration, I'm wondering to what extent the foreign ministry at this point in time actually takes into account how critical it is for Germany's success in Europe to have a stable alliance with America in particular, and that NATO is functioning. And I'm just curious to get your assessment on that in terms of a post-Merkel German government and the kind of sensitivity that the next German government might bring to those complex demands on German foreign policy as far as NATO is concerned. Let's maybe, Michael, if you want to start, we go the other way around this time. Do you want to start, Michael?
Michael, it's you.
Well, Michael, can you hear us? Oh, if not, Constanze, you heard me?
Yes, I
can. Just going from the back, if you want to start this time.
Sure. I said a few things about NATO in my last round of comments, so I'll sort of skip over that and just say something very briefly about China. That this is, I think, what would be ideal, regardless of what happens in November. That the U.S. pushes Europe to be much more careful about China's economic statecraft, to recognize that it is geopolitical, not necessarily military, but it is geopolitical in intent, and there are lots of consequences that flow from that. It's not just wealth and commerce that matter. It's a larger geopolitical or strategic vision, and Germany, I think, has a ways to go, and most other countries do as well. And so, in this sense, I would say U.S. should be playing the role of pushing Europe not towards greater confrontation with China, but sort of maybe more accurate assessment of what China is and what its plans are for the future. To either contradict or qualify this point, I would say the opposite thing almost from the European perspective, that Europe should try to restrain the U.S. I think both parties are running much too quickly toward a confrontational position on China. It's wonderful to see an area in which, apart from sanctioning Russia, on which Democrats and Republicans agree on foreign policy, but I wonder if they perhaps agree too much here and are too unconsidered in terms of what the potential cost would be if we would cross the threshold from whatever it is now, competition, contestation, into something that would be overtly military. We need to remember all of the anxieties that were so palpably felt at the beginning of the Cold War, and I think Europeans are often much better, with their experience of 2 world wars on their continent, much better at remembering those horrors and factoring them into their foreign policy. They should be front and center with our China policy, and there I think Europe has a very important voice that needs to be heard in Washington.
Thank you, Constanze.
All right. Let me say as well. It's in a world. Let me start over. I think the Trump years and the pandemic have shown us that interdependence is inescapable. It's the condition in which we live. And it is, in fact, it has deepened to a degree that I think it makes sense to speak of international relations today as an ecosystem. With a lot of, I think, very interesting consequences for the way that we handle international relations and our behavior and our obligations towards each other. That's maybe for explanation another time. But what that means is that there are now and will be in the future issues where we have to not just talk, but work with powers that are behaving as challengers, as adversaries, even as spoilers in the international order. There is no way around this. But my second point is, and I'm sorry, and obviously those what are those issues? They're climate change, they are international norms, international institutions. We have to work with each other. We have to work with each other on biodiversity, on environmental degradation, on the freedom of the seas. I can think of a whole panoply of issues. That said, I think that Europeans are still having a hard time understanding and acknowledging and factoring into our foreign policy and our security policy the degree to which Russia, China, but also Iran, and to some degree NATO members like Turkey, have become challengers, competitors, and spoilers in regional policy and in global relations. That is the challenge of the day. In other words, of managing the coexistence of necessary cooperation and mitigating or managing friction and conflict. And that is where I think Europeans and Germans in particular have a genuine blind spot. There is a degree to which it seems to me that we are in denial about the fact that Nord Stream 2, seen from Moscow, is not an economic project. Because, I mean, studies even from Russia and from Russian economists and banks have shown that it is economically unnecessary for Russia or for Europe, for that matter. But it is very much a political project. Likewise, the Chinese acquiring companies, ports, and digital infrastructure is, of course, a political project. And the Chinese themselves have, with their recent diplomacy made very clear what the nature of that project is. Let me also remind you that it is highly unusual for the German government to have determined with such speed and such clarity that the poisoning of Alexander Navalny in Russia was an act perpetrated with the highest possible probability by Russian state security services. Remember how reluctant the Germans were to come on board with the British position, the similar British position about the poisoning of the Skripals in Salisbury. Remember how that it took the Germans 5 years to attribute the Bundestag hack to the GRU. remember that it took nearly a year to attribute the Tiergarten murder in broad daylight to the GRU. So there is clearly movement there in Germany, but I think we still haven't quite, I don't think that this has been digested fully by German elite opinion. I don't think it's been digested fully by the German larger public, what that means for our relationships with these countries. And let me also remind you that there are parts of the German center-left who are hoping for a center-left coalition in 2021 after Merkel steps down. And that Die Linke, I mean, Omid, I'm sure will have something to say about this, but Die Linke sort of has made it very clear that they see Russia essentially as Germany's friend on these issues. I think, to me, that makes this notion of that kind of coalition really rather difficult. I'm very curious to hear what Omid has to say about this, so I'm going to shut up at this interesting point and hand over to you.
First, Professor Viola, and then the last word.
Okay, so on China, I think that Professor Kimmage is right. We should not rush to declare a new Cold War. I think that there has been some of this discourse circulating in the United States, and that it is dangerous and it's problematic. And I also don't see a military conflict with China as inevitable, as some other analysts have declared. But I do think that it is important for Europe to understand that the economic ties to China are also political. And here I would absolutely want to underscore what Constanze Stelzenmüller has already said. So, when Italy decides that it wants to be part of the Belt and Road Initiative, right, this has tremendous political consequences for Europe and the EU. So it has to be taken in that light. And I think that the political strategy behind the economic relations has not yet been significantly or sufficiently addressed. I do think that Biden will be under a lot of pressure. He said it already, to be tough on China. And I think that that will put Europe in turn under pressure as well. I think that this sort of equivalence or hedging on China will be a difficult position for Europe to maintain in the future. It will be pushed to insist on investment reciprocity, on protection of critical infrastructure by the United States. So I do anticipate that relationship to become much more politicized. On NATO, I think that here we also have a problem of hedging in a sense. So if NATO, does NATO have to live forever? Is anything forever? I mean, I think that we need to take really seriously the possibility that the United States won't be willing to provide the security umbrella for Europe that it was willing to provide in the past. And if that's the case, then Europeans will need to decide, will they invest more and take over more of the burden for NATO, or will they decide to build a an integrated European defense community? And I think that the whole trouble there, the dilemma, is that these two things push in different directions, right? So investing more in NATO means trying not to, it means investing in NATO, and doesn't mean investing in a separate, decoupled, duplicate European defense system. On the other hand, investing in European defense means that or I think what's happened so far is that the lack of investment in European defense is the result of knowing that NATO is there in the background. So I think these two things are pushing in different directions, and being on the fence is not going to cut it anymore. So there, I think we're going to need some more European powers stepping up in one direction or another, because I don't think that it would be reasonable to expect the United States, with its own changing strategic interests, to be providing the same kind of security umbrella that it provided, for example, during the Cold War or immediately after the Cold War, because the United States has an interest in NATO, but it's not the same kind of interest it was in the past.
Last word, and then we open up. Omid.
The question of the coalition in Germany is the easiest one. We are ready to make a coalition with any single democratic party which is ready to do what we want. the rest is about reading polls. Russia, I think I pointed out that the reassurance NATO is giving to Central European countries is inevitable for the coherence of the European Union, and this is because they are highly concerned of Russian aggressions. We had 90,000 people, 90,000 soldiers strong snap exercise of the Russians next to the Estonian border in 2016, which was not declared by the rules of the Helsinki procedure. This is scary, and this is why NATO is important, and this is why we are there, and this is why we need NATO. Is this forever? I don't know. This is the question we have to ask the White House, because the challenges are coming from and the denial is coming from that side. By the way, for the last 2 weeks in Berlin, in smaller rounds, we discussed the question if it's really crazy to imagine that the Americans gonna withdraw from the United Nations before the general elections, because of the snapback situation we have there. And when it comes to Iran, we had a situation when the foreign minister when the Secretary of State Pompeo announced that, this is what he said, not explicitly but implicitly and very, very clearly, all of the other members of the Security Council, including Germany and then Great Britain and then France, are standing with terrorists, because we are not. We are asking them why they want to use mechanism they gave up 2 years ago. So this is not reliable, and this is the biggest problem of the last 3 years, 4 years, 3.5 years. China. I fully understand all of the people who say Europe should take a tougher stand, but to be honest, first, I really do not understand what the American side is meaning when they talk about tougher stand. On China, it's more clear, but saying that we should be tougher to Iran, for example, while the Americans are doing everything to withdraw the inspectors of the international agency out of the Iranian nuclear power plant, is not a real tougher stand. But we see a huge shift of mood in Europe toward China for the last 6 or 7 months. We have much more coherence than we had before. I would say 27 minus 1, and this 1 is always Hungary, are now much more together when it comes to China. Czech Republic has turned 180 degrees for the last 2 years. The president of the Senate of Czech Republic even visited Taiwan last week. It was not imaginable 2 years ago, and there are a lot of reasons for that. One reason is all these countries of the 17+1 or 1+17 procedure, which was a tool of, still is a tool of China to divide Europe, started to map not only the infrastructure China is buying, and by the way, there is not one single bigger port within the European Union without Chinese shareholders now, not a single one, but they also started to map the broken promises of investments of China, and there are a lot of. They always came in and promised prosperity and tons of jobs, and they did not deliver. Others, maybe you saw the presser of President Vučić at the beginning of the pandemics when he kissed the Chinese flag, announcing that the European solidarity is a myth, and Europe would not help within the pandemic, during the pandemic, while China is doing. What he did not say, but everybody understood, also in Serbia, was that the masks China delivered were paid by the European Union, of course. And anybody knows the pictures of the masks Chinese brought into Italy in the days of Bergamo? The end of the day, any single one in Italy understood that they just delivered 200,000 masks, which is not really a big help. It's helpful for 2 days for the medical staff in the region of Bergamo. So people see that China is not delivering, and this is shifting the mind of a lot of people in Europe, and this is good. But this does not mean that we take a tough stand in a sense of decoupling. Decoupling is madness, and we shouldn't do that. There are the three terms of Europe: systemic rivalry, contest, and partnership. And we definitely also need partnership. We do not have to compare these three or put them on the same level, because we always have a systemic rivalry. But sectorally, we have rivalries on one hand, and then partnership on the other hand. Constanze just mentioned climate protection. We won't go nowhere without partnering with China on this. There are a lot of issues like that. The problem is that it's easy now for China and for Russia to announce that they are multilateralists sticking to international law, which they do not, in a moment when the American president just do not care for international law very loudly.
Well, we have about 15 minutes left for questions, comments from the floor or from the internet, if there is someone interested to join. Who wants to go first? Please raise your hand, and then a microphone will come closer to you. Everybody seems to be convinced. Matthias Lutz-Bachmann, hier vorne.
Thank you for this wonderful and rich discussion. Even it is the most broad topic of our conference. We cannot focus on one or the other point alone. So it is the interdependency of all these economic, political, and cultural issues you brought forward. For that reason, first of all, thank you very much. Let me pose one question. Given the possible situation that there is not only a competition or a rivalry, but a conflict among America and China, why should the American administration not try to bring Putin and Russia in the American coalition against China, and in doing so, skipping the NATO, which was founded, first of all, to protect the North Atlantic Hemisphere against Russia, which would be a topic old-fashioned in the situation of a conflict among America and China.
Maybe we just collect a few views and then maybe go back to the panel here in the middle.
Okay, I think the boundaries between values and economic interests get increasingly blurred. I think, you were saying while there should be actually a lot of commonality in values between Europe and United States towards China and Russia, there are obviously matters of American consensus and interest which become vital. For example, Nord Stream is an interesting one. Yeah, so it's a political project in Moscow, but I think there's an American interest to bring LNG to Europe. Yeah, for various topics. I think what's also interesting is the speed at which the Trump administration dismantled TikTok in the United States, based on the claim that vital American consumer data moved to China now. That's an interesting one. I think we have in Europe the situation that the big US platform economies that actually are basically, have a full monopoly situation in Europe, including the cloud service providers, basically also are all American. The data are in the US, yeah. So, and I think the interesting is, do we, because of that, because of the value commonality, we say we tolerate that, or should we have a clear stance as well, especially as these companies are not paying taxes in Europe either? Yeah? So shouldn't it become part of the new, also the stance towards the new American government, no matter who it is, to be as a European, maybe yes, to say we are willing to step up our defense, but we're also stepping up on our basically on our rules on data privacy and having US platforms pay taxes in the European Union and actually apply the same claims on data basically ownership to US companies.
Is there anybody for a final question? All right. Thank you very much. Then we go back to the panel and maybe Omid Nouripour, we want to start and then go way backwards.
Obviously, there is a huge mistrust between Beijing and Moscow. But to be honest, I just can't imagine that this is going to be it's going to be ever smaller than the mistrust between Moscow and Washington. I just, this is maybe because of my lack of imagination, but I can't imagine that Kremlin gonna shift to or team up with the US against China. No, my answer is no way. Maybe I'm wrong, but no way. I just want to go after this myth of Nord Stream 2 and LNG. Definitely right that the American interest to push against Nord Stream is for their interest to sell us some LNG. But to be honest, we do not need that. And I'm not talking about renewables coming immediately. I'm talking about European energy. So to be honest, I'm shocked to see after all of the campaigning we did for the last two weeks against Nord Stream and for the last years against Nord Stream, I'm fully shocked to see that now there are plans in the German federal government to spend 1 billion euros for buying US LNG to keep that conflict calm. This is madness. This is some kind of a shield of please blackmail me. And this is not the way we should go to. I do not see that we should compare TikTok and Facebook. I think it's wrong to ban TikTok. By the way, it's not that fast. This is a longer debate, not only in the United States. 2 months ago, India banned 59 Indian Chinese applications, including WeChat and TikTok, because everybody who is dealing with that for longer term knows that both of them are data phishing apps for the Chinese Communist Party also. To be honest, WeChat is much worse, but TikTok is not that good. So I wouldn't ban none of this, but maybe just creating awareness for that. WeChat is the most convenient communication app on earth and the worst one. There are a couple of differences between Facebook or whomever and TikTok. But at the end of the day, this is first why I would disagree with anyone who is arguing for decoupling. Decoupling is there's no way to decouple, but we have, of course, to be aware of that, what's going on in China when it comes to technology, much more than in any other country. I do not see the difference or the conflict between values and interests. Not when it comes to the systemic rivalry, because at the end of the day, democracies just cannot afford for a long term to have a discord between these two things. I think that we have a lot of companies who are earning their money in China. I don't want to ban or boycott none of them. But at the end of the day, of course, we are discussing with Volkswagen, for example, if they think that on the long term it's helpful for them to build parts of their cars in Xinjiang, knowing that people there are putting in a very, very polite way exploited. when I worked there, and then we talked to Volkswagen, asking if they know that there could be any time campaigning against that, and I hope that they're going to understand that one very, very soon. Same on Russia. Russia is occupying parts of 3 neighbor countries in Europe, and there are sanctions against them. But there are, just once again, Volkswagen's investment level in Russia is 32 billion euros. It's not about withdrawal, it's about rethinking. And this is what we have to talk about.
Professor Viola, last words.
Okay, thanks for those 2 questions. On Russia and China, I think that we see Russia trying to engage with China. There are strategic reasons for that. They do it in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, for example, also with the Belt and Road Initiative. But there are analysts out there who propose exactly what you suggested, that at the long term there are a lot of tensions between Russia and China, and China is, at the end of the day, also much closer to Russia than the United States is. So wouldn't it make strategic sense for Russia to be, in a sense, more concerned with its dependence on China and therefore align more with the West, the United States and Europe? And I think that I have to agree that it's difficult to see it happening, right? I don't see it in the cards. I think there are historical reasons why we don't see it in the cards, but that doesn't mean that the relationship between Russia and China will be an easy or a smooth one. I think that we already see it's a very tense one, but I think that Russia also can't afford not to cooperate with China. So I don't think that China is going to push Putin into the arms of the United States or NATO or Europe anytime soon. But I think this is really indicative of the kind of balance that we're going to be seeing. Many countries trying to figure out how they position themselves between these 2 really important players. On values and interests and digital technology, I think that it's really important to realize that the United States has interests and has political interests, and those don't always overlap with European interests, right? So the relationship doesn't mean there aren't going to be any conflicts. There are conflicts of interest even, and I think in data security is a big one, and also with different views on how to protect privacy, for example, and also what happens with this data, how is data transferred, data trade, things like this. So I don't think that we should in any way say, oh, the United States, Europe should side with the United States and there will not be any political conflicts there. There are real economic and interest conflicts there that need to be sorted out. I do think, though, we perhaps need to come away from this values versus interests debate in a different way. So not necessarily by saying, well, they could align, although I don't think they always align. I think they could align. That's one approach. But I think another way to see this is to think about the institutional structures at work. So I think that at the end of the day, one real difference for Europe in partnering with the United States versus China is that there are very different institutional structures at work in both countries. And as bad as it looks at the moment in the United States, it has a very strong institutional framework that is, first of all, much more transparent than the Chinese one. It is democratic. And it's, as we've talked about all day, very flawed, but there is, a system of rules and rights that Europeans can navigate, and I think that it makes the political relationship with China so much more difficult for Europe. So it's not to say that the United States doesn't push its own interests. Certainly it does, and those don't always coincide with European interests, and Europe should definitely be prepared for conflict on that. But there are also good reasons why collaborating with the United States is just much easier than with China, that aren't just based on values, but also simply on the institutional structures that are available.
Thank you. Let's go to Washington for the final round, and Constanze goes first, please.
Sure. I want to say thank you very much for inviting me to speak at this conference. It's been fun and informative for me. I hope it's been that way for you, because I imagine it must be quite stressful to be sitting in the audience and sort of zipping back and forth between people sitting on the podium, between sort of glass panes, and people sort of talking, from an ocean away. So thank you for your forbearance. I think that on the first question of Putin sort of faced with, the choice between the US and China, my sense is that really he's trying to leverage both. And that's been the Kremlin strategy for quite a while now. The reasons for an alignment between Russia and China are clear. Professor Viola has explained those. But it's also clear that I think Putin is trying to sort of pull the Trump administration on his side on a variety of things. And certainly a number of things that the Trump administration has done have really helped the Kremlin's cause. And not the least of that is the constant questioning and undermining of NATO, whether it's on rolling back European arms control arrangements and treaties, whether it's on questioning whether Article 5 applies to Macedonia or Montenegro, I think it was. Even we learned from the Bolton book that the president was much closer to actually taking America out of NATO than we thought he was. But the point here is to see that there has been a lot of damage done without that happening. And I think, I would also, again, for the purpose of even-handedness, point out that European equivocation on defense spending, on maintaining our side of the obligation, of course, contributes to that. All of that has been deeply unhelpful. And maybe to Professor Viola's point, is NATO necessary? I'd say it's a pretty damn good option right now. It has worked extraordinarily well. And let's not forget that it has also served American interests, because America has interests in Europe, and it has interests in the Middle East and in Northern Africa. And having the European alliance and having its enormous bases in Europe also helps American interests, which are not pursued through NATO. So I think that there is a significant argument to be made that America has a vested interest in maintaining the health of this alliance for purposes that have nothing to do with the alliance. So that's one thing. But I think on the first question, what I'm asking myself is what would be Vladimir Putin's asking price for American for helping America address the Chinese challenge. And I suspect that asking price is well known to us, and it's the acceptance of Russian spheres of interest in Europe's eastern neighborhood, from Belarus to the Caucasus. And given the demonstrations that we're currently seeing in Belarus, given what we've seen happening in Ukraine, a proxy war in which more than 10,000 people have been killed so far in the last 5 years, I think that it is incompatible with either our values or our interests as Europeans to let that happen. So that's my answer to the first question. And that is a very natural segue into the second question about values and interest. Yes, the Americans want to sell us an LNG. But that's not the only reason why Nord Stream 2 is a questionable political project. And what I find astounding about this line of criticism is that it always leaves out the strategic objections of our Eastern European neighbors, which have been expressed many, many times, and I find utterly convincing. I don't understand how we can ignore that. Should we tax US tech platforms? Sure. I have no problem with that. But again, to suggest that TikTok and the US tech platforms are exactly the same thing is, in my view, to construct a false equivalence, in the same way that equating American LNG sales with Nord Stream 2 is a false equivalence. And finally, let's just keep in mind that German energy policy is full of internal contradictions. I'm sure that Omid Nouripour and his Green colleagues have a great deal to say of that, but it is hardly it is, I mean, I think that we should, be honest with ourselves and say that it is not just full of internal contradictions, but there is an immense amount of hypocrisy involved. I mean, our posture on coal is indefensible. So I will leave it at that and say thank you very much for inviting me to this really interesting debate. I've learned a great deal. And I hope you all have a great weekend in Bad Homburg, which I wish I was in physically.
Thank you, Constanze. Michael.
Let me echo Constanze's thanks for the invitation and for the, for me, very informative and illuminating panel. To start with the Russia question, in terms of the scenarios that Constanze was asking us to think about, or asking her European colleagues to think about, certainly this is one that should be entertained for a second Trump term, that there could be a dramatic rapprochement between the United States and Russia at the expense of Europe and at the expense of NATO. And if Trump were to do this, he's made these arguments many times and refers to Kissinger's influence when he does, it would be, sort of under the rubric of great power competition. I don't think it's terribly likely to occur, but it's a scenario that might be worth entertaining sort of theoretically. I think it's a very good philosophical question because I think it underscores the opportunity cost of the current situation. There's a broken relationship between the West and Russia. For that, I would say the West is 25% responsible and Russia is 75% responsible, but it's very, very costly. And it's not just with China, where I think it is objectively costly. It's also with Turkey, which Russia is trying to pry away from NATO and from Europe or for the West, as it were. We need to be thinking, this is not, I think, the answer you were looking for. We need to be thinking about ways to make this relationship unbroken. I don't have a recipe. If I did, I would offer it to you. And in the time that we cannot fix this relationship, we need to be impatient with the costs of its being broken. So I think that's the right kind of question to ask philosophically, and it's a good spur to reflection. But practically, it wouldn't work, I think, for all the reasons that Constanze illustrates. And it just won't work with Putin at this stage. Who knows how long he'll still be in power, but he's not going to mend bridges with Washington, or I think with Berlin at this point, and he would pocket concessions and just keep on going with China as he wishes to go. So I think it's a sort of practical policy impossibility, but a terrific philosophical question to ponder. In terms of economic interests, I don't want to speak on behalf of what Europeans should do, but I'll venture to do that in the spirit of your question. I mean, I think economic interests are important. It doesn't seem to me that Europe is so shy about pursuing them from an American point of view, but maybe you could be more forthright in some ways. But it's all about balancing this with the other foreign policy priorities that Europe has. And of these, I think there are sort of two other big considerations. One is, of course, defense and security, where the U.S. is still an invaluable partner, so you wouldn't want to have too much friction. And then there's just the partnership or friendship itself. And I realize this is very difficult when Trump is speaking the way he does, behaving the way he does with his zero-sum view and his economic bottom line. Perhaps there's a temptation to sort of go in a similar direction, but that's harming American foreign policy. And I don't think Europe would benefit from putting economic interests way ahead of these other things. And, I was just struck by the phrase that Ambassador Chariot used yesterday evening, so I'll repeat it and sort of conclude on that note. Die Werte der Aufklärung. It's something that you want to preserve. The U.S. is not doing a good job of defending those values at the moment, but it will return to them. And you wouldn't want, in a way, too robust a sort of economic policy to be perceived on the American side as an impediment to that return. So I'll just conclude on that note.
Well, thank you very much to our four panelists, especially our colleagues in Washington, for giving us their time, as well as Brother Viola and Omid Nouripour. Thanks for you for staying here. It was a long day for us here in Bad Homburg, but I think it was an enlightening day as well. And we had a great round towards the end of the conference. Thank you very much to the organizers for having this group here in Bad Homburg on a Saturday, and for making us, putting us into a position to start a conversation on the future of transatlantic relations, which will obviously, the day should have made that very clear, remains central for our fate. Thank you very much, and I'm returning back, if I should, to anybody here from the team. If not, I just say thank you very much for coming, and goodbye.
give me the chance to say thank you to you, our audience, our participants, all who asked and participated in the discussions on floor and in the breaks. Thank you to all our invited speakers and discussants. It was an important step forward for us, the Forschungskolleg Humanwissenschaften of the Goethe University, to start a new dimension of our academic work, namely to look out for possibilities to constitute a transatlantic forum on security, on culture, on politics, on questions of the everyday life, on democracy, and everything which is important to us and to the future of the next generations. Thank you for being with us, and you are welcomed to join us the next year when we have the next big Bad Homburg conference, which is based on the wonderful and fruitful cooperation among Goethe University and the city of Bad Homburg. Thank you. I wish you now a nice weekend. Thank you.